Randy stood patiently waiting for his half-brother Rolf to meet him to go snowmobiling on a wintry Saturday just 3 days before Christmas. He tried to call to confirm they were going to meet outside of the locked security gates just down the road from the private cabin, but although he called and waited for an answer, he couldn't get through. The phone line was dead. He didn't know it, but just an hour or two earlier, those phone lines had been cut and the two men who had done it were on a murderous rampage. And they were heading straight for where Randy was waiting. This is Red Rum, stories about the true victims of crime. This show is made from various source documents listed in the show notes. I use news archives, documentary footage and court documents, and so the episodes are accurate to the source materials I can find. You can find all episodes as a YouTube or podcast version in the description box down below. On the 20th of December at 11 a.m, Kay had walked off of the aeroplane with her 17-year-old son, Sean, and they were greeted by Kay's sister, Claudia. Claudia noticed immediately that Kay had changed her hair. It was very, very different to how she'd seen her before, and the two hugged. They were really just glad to be back with each other again. And the conversation continued, and they were talking about the upcoming Christmas party at Kay's cabin. It was tradition, and this year all of the family would be coming up to celebrate with them. This was something Kay looked forward to every single year, and she described it as being in the comfort of her favourite cabin with all of her favourite people. Kay's husband Rolf would be flying in the following day with the pair's two daughters, Lene and Trisha. The couple had come up with this plan of always travelling separately, just in case something happened to one of them on their travels. That way, there'd always be one parent to look after the children if, by way of chance, anything went wrong and one of the parents succumbed to some sort of injury or death. They were incredibly forward thinking in this way, and they really, really did look out for any possibility of trouble or anything that would upset the sort of family unit. Kay, Claudia and Sean were now in their car and they were travelling towards the direction of the cabin. But Kay looked out of the window and she saw this tall, thin, young man just standing on the side of the road. He was wearing a light jacket, some Levi's and some tennis shoes. And this was odd to Kay because he was standing in these freezing cold, -20-degree temperatures, wearing these kinds of clothes. It just wasn't a good idea. Claudia noticed that the man looked freezing cold, and so she suggested that they should pull over and see if he needed any help. And so they pulled forward a little more and then pulled off to the side of the road and stopped right by the young man. They wound down the window and called out, saying how cold it was and asked if he needed any help. But the man just ignored them. Even after they called out for a second time, the man simply refused to acknowledge that they were there and that they were talking to him. And so Kay, Claudia and Sean didn't really have any other choice. They knew that he must be freezing and he needed some kind of help, but with him refusing to communicate with them, they just didn't know what to do. And so they decided to just drive on and continue their journey to their cabin. The following day, Rolf arrived at the cabin with Lene and Trisha, and Kay told Rolf pretty much straight away about this man that she'd seen on the side of the road. And she said that she'd been thinking about it all night, she couldn't get it out of her head, and she just had a really bad feeling and she was quite scared. She thought something bad was going to happen, so much so that Kay told Rolf he needed to get the guns out of the car. And Rolf said that there wasn't any necessity for this. He didn't really understand why Kay was so upset. It was incredibly unlike her, and so he tried to convince her that everything would be okay and he didn't need to take the precaution of getting the guns into the cabin. In fact, he told her that he thought that young man was someone that he had run into on his way up to the cabin. There was a man driving this three-wheeler in the snow, but it was clear to Rolf that he really didn't know how to drive it. And so Rolf had pulled over, asked if he needed any help, and he had actually pulled him out of the snowbank. The entire time, the man that he'd just helped did act kind of aloof and distant, and so as soon as Rolf had helped him, he and his daughters just continued their journey, and they didn't really give it another thought. They just wanted to get to the cabin. Kay's sister Claudia stayed that night, and Kay tried to convince Claudia to stay the following day, but she said she couldn't, she needed to go back, and she felt okay leaving Kay at the cabin now that Rolf was there, now that the two girls were there. But Sean said, can he go back with Claudia? He didn't really want to be around at that time. He just wanted to stay with Claudia in her house. And so they decided that, yeah, that was fine. And she left at around 4 p.m. on the 21st of December. Claudia gave Kay a hug, and then she hopped on the snowmobile to head to the car, which was about a 2-mile journey down to the car. This was normal for this time of year near the cabin. There was no way that a car would get up through the snow, and so they had these snowmobiles easily accessible. Rolf knew how to drive them, as did the two daughters, Lene and Trisha. It was really common for them to use these vehicles. On the 21st of December, Kay, Rolf, Lene and Trisha had driven over to Salt Lake City to stay with Kay's mum, Beth. The following day, on the 22nd of December, they drove back to the cabin in 2 separate vehicles. Beth, her daughter Kay and her daughter Lene all arrived back at the cabin at 1:45 p.m. The 3 of them drove up the long driveway and into the garage. And when they arrived, Lene looked up and she noticed someone that she thought someone was looking out of the window of the master bedroom. She blinked and then that person was gone. She realised that perhaps there wasn't anyone there after all. She didn't say anything at the time, assuming that if it was anyone, it may have been her cousin David, probably playing some kind of prank on them. Perhaps he'd arrived early and he wanted to surprise them. And so Lene bounded up the stairs into the living room, expecting to either be the first one there or at the very most see her cousin David there, which would be an exciting thing for her. But when she got into the living room, she was met by a stranger. There was this man with frizzy hair wearing a grey sweatshirt, and the grey sweatshirt she recognised as actually belonging to her dad. So this man must have been in the house for some time to get that, and he emerged from just behind the fridge and stood in front of her. That man was holding a gun, pointing it directly at her head. And then another man appeared next to him, also holding a gun, pointing it at Lene. What the 3 of them didn't know was that the night before, when they'd been staying with Kay's mum, Beth, in Salt Lake City, 2 men, Edward Deli and Vaughn Taylor, had broken into the family's cabin. The 2 men both had criminal records. Vaughn had a relatively normal childhood, but once he was into his teenage years, he began committing petty crimes, which ended up resulting in aggravated burglary. Edward had been convicted of arson, and eventually they'd both been released from prison, and they had gone to stay in this halfway house. As part of their stay there, they were both allowed to actually leave and go out and look for employment, but as soon as they got the opportunity to, they fled. They spent the following few days together and they hitchhiked up to Oakley in Utah. They'd chosen to go to that area because one of the men actually had a family member who owned a cabin up there. They'd already robbed a number of cabins in the area, but when they realised that there were actually people staying at that particular one cabin, Kay's cabin, they decided that would be their final stop. But their journey up to the cabin hadn't been as incognito as they'd both planned. Vaughn was in fact that tall, skinny man that Kay and Claudia had seen at the side of the road. And the man that Rolf had helped at the side of the road, helped pull his 3-wheeler out of the snow, that was one of those men too. Once the men arrived at the cabin, they took a shower, they dried themselves, they ate food out of the pantry, they slept in the family's beds, and they put clothes on from the closets, which is why when Lene had come inside, she'd seen one of these men in her dad's sweatshirt. And then that following morning, Vaughn picked up the cabin's phone and he called the number of the halfway house. He spoke to a man called Scott and he told him that he and Edward were at a cabin and they were going to, quote, waste the husband, the wife and the son. They then planned on stealing the family's car and abducting the 2 daughters, who they said they were going to then take to New York City and then sell them to devil worshippers, which was for use in satanic rituals. And that's something that will come up again and again in this case, that Vaughn especially said that he was a Satan worshipper. Vaughn and Edward had really made themselves at home in the cabin. As they'd arrived, they'd seen that the Christmas tree was already stacked with presents underneath it, and Vaughn had began unwrapping those presents, just throwing them about, discarding one for the next. And then Edward had come across this video camera. It belonged to the family and it was just there. And so he had started to record Vaughn and later on, the police would find these videos. It wasn't long after that Beth, Kay and Lene had returned home, and Lene was now standing in front of these two men with their guns pointed at her head. Vaughan asked Lene who was downstairs, and she replied that it was her mother and her grandmother. He then demanded that she call them upstairs so they would come quickly, which she did, and they arrived just a matter of seconds later. And as soon as they did, these two men pointed their guns at all three of the family members, sort of going in between them, and they demanded that Kay and her mother took off all of their jewellery and hand it over. They did so immediately, including handing over diamonds and a Rolex watch. And Kay said that the men could have whatever they wanted, but this was not met well. This was met with one of the men shouting at Kay to just sit down. And Beth, Kay's mother, did sit down, but Kay refused to, and almost as soon as she said no, there was a loud popping noise, and then there was another and another, and this went on 9 times. 3 shots went into Kay's mother, Beth, and after she fell to the floor, Vaughan shouted, quote, "This bitch won't die." He then shot her again 2 more times in the head, this time killing her. 3 of the bullets had hit Kay, and she had also fallen to the floor as well. And that's when Vaughan had heard Lene praying, and he just laughed at her. He said that he didn't believe in God and that he worshipped Satan. Praying wasn't going to help her. Edward then dragged Lene into the bedroom, and he picked up a dirty sock which he stuffed into her mouth to try and keep her quiet. Then he pulled off a strip of duct tape, he put it around her mouth so that the sock was in there, the tape was over, and he told her to be quiet. He then pulled off even more duct tape and used it to tie her hands and feet together so that she couldn't move. And then, in some kind of act of kindness, is what he said, but to be honest, I think it was just to get the animal out of the way, Edward brought the dog into the bedroom with Lene. He could hear how distraught Lene was. She was really trying to scream and even just breathe with this duct tape over her mouth, and it sounded as though she was choking. And so he quickly removed that duct tape and the sock from her mouth to allow her a few breaths before forcing it back on and duct taping her again. He needed to make sure she knew he was serious though, and so he held a knife to her throat, threatening her once again, saying that he had killed a man in a New York drug deal less than a year before. He assured her he knew what he was doing. After that, Edward returned and he helped Vaughan to drag the bodies of Kay and her mother Beth out onto the patio. And they needed to decide what to do next. They weren't sure if they were going to kill Lene or if they were going to take her with them. At 2:45 p.m, Rolf and Trisha were making their way up the driveway towards the cabin. They had been out picking up a snowmobile from the repair shop, and they were now just an hour after the other family members had arrived home. As they were making their way up the driveway towards the garage in the lower level of the cabin, Edward and Vaughan heard this snowmobile noise outside, and so Edward forced the knife that he was holding on the side of Lene's neck. He forced it a little harder, and then he forced her to go down the stairs. And it was at this point that Vaughan told Edward to shoot Rolf, but Edward refused. He said no, he was going to deal with the girls instead. And so Vaughan decided that he'd do it. As Rolf walked into the cabin, Vaughan just pointed the shotgun right at him and he pulled the trigger. Rolf was shot in the face straight away, and both of his daughters actually saw this happen. They watched as their father fell to the floor and they were helpless to do anything. They were then forced outside by Edward whilst Vaughan stayed inside with Rolf's body. And he needed to make sure that Rolf was dead. So he started to pour petrol or gas over him. And he continued to do this before spreading the gasoline throughout the rest of the house. But he wasn't done there. He needed to make sure that Rolf hadn't somehow survived this shot to the head. And so he marched up to Rolf's body, which was now drenched in gasoline, and he shot him once more at point blank range. Vaughan had been so close to him with that second shot, he was actually pressing the barrel to his head, that the plastic casing from the bullet had become actually embedded in his skull. That was the final thing he needed to do in the house. Finally, he lit a match, dropped it, and then he ran towards the door where Edward had already prepared the snowmobiles and made Lene and Trisha be in the driver's seat because they were the ones that knew how to drive them. The two men didn't. And they forced Lene and Trisha to drive off into the distance. It was a 2-mile trip on the snowmobiles before they reached the locked gate. And as they approached it, they could see someone far in the distance. This person was waiting on the other side of the gates, and they soon realised that it was Randy Zorn. He was Trisha and Lene's uncle. He'd arranged to meet Rolf, his half-brother, to go snowmobiling. And he had been waiting there for some time. He was waiting in his 4-wheel drive. He was aware that there was no way he could get through that locked gate without Rolf's help. And Randy had even tried to call the cabin telephone to try and confirm the meeting, but he couldn't get through. What he didn't realise at the time was that Vaughn and Edward had actually cut the phone lines to the cabin, just as a way to ensure that no one would be able to call for help once the attacks had started. And so Randy just waited. He was concerned. This was completely unlike Rolf to not show up, but just as he was considering what he should do, whether he should wait a little longer or turn back around and head home, he'd looked up and he'd seen Lene and Trisha on their way down on the snowmobiles. And as they drew closer, he managed to catch a glimpse of their 2 male passengers, 2 people who he didn't recognise. Lene and Trisha managed to unlock the gates and they continued forward. And that's when Randy called out, saying hello to them and waving. But the girls just ignored him. And Vaughn asked who that man was, but Lene said that she didn't know. She quickly made up a story about not knowing who he was and that the man must have thought they were someone else. Maybe he was just a friendly neighbour. And thankfully, Vaughn believed her. Now that the gates were open, Randy needed to decide what to do. It was extremely odd that his nieces had just ignored him, but he didn't really have time to think about that, because as he looked up, he saw another snowmobile coming towards him from the direction of the cabin. The snowmobile looked familiar, and as it drew closer, he realised that it was Rolf on his snowmobile. But by the time it reached Randy, he could see that the person on the snowmobile was covered with blood, and it was in fact his brother, but his head had been so badly damaged and it was so badly swollen that it was hard to know for sure that it was him. He just recognised his clothes. He quickly pulled Rolf into his 4-wheel drive and tried to get him to talk, but he couldn't say much, just that he had been shot, his wife had been killed, and his 2 daughters had been taken. They were in trouble. He said, quote, "Save my girls," before he flopped to the side and went silent. And so the chase was on. Randy began driving in the direction the girls had gone in, and he also got his phone out to call 911, and he blurted out as much as he could, but remember, he's in the mountains and signal isn't great, so he got about halfway through his story and he's trying to be concise. He's trying to just give them the details they know before his phone cuts out. He just loses signal. He continued driving, getting just a little further, fully aware that his brother is in the backseat, unconscious and possibly dead. And that is when they arrived at the convenience store in Oakley. Randy jumped out of the car and used the outside telephone to call 911 and finish telling them what had happened and where he was. Now, thankfully, they had already heard enough on his first call to sort of surmise where he was, and they dispatched emergency services for Rolf, as well as sending out a number of police officers to pursue the men who had abducted Lene and Trisha. The emergency helicopter sent to Rolf arrived within minutes and they airlifted him to hospital. They found that one of the bullets had gone through Ralph's skull and fortunately missed his brain. And the other bullet misfired, but it still absolutely wrecked his face. It was so bad, in fact, that it had taken Randy a few seconds to realise that it actually was him. Even though he was wearing what he recognised as his brother's clothes, he couldn't quite compute that it was him and couldn't see from his face that it definitely was his brother. It turned out, after Vaughn had lit that match on and set the house on fire, he'd raced towards the door of the cabin, and Rolf had felt the heat of the fire getting closer and closer. And in his confused state, he had actually tried to put it out with his hands. He was, of course, completely drenched in gasoline, and so it was almost pure chance that he hadn't been just ignited and burned alive. But as soon as he realised what was going on, he ran straight to the bathroom, jumped into the shower, and started to strip off all of his gasoline-soaked clothes. He then pulled on some clothes that were nearest to him, still dripping wet from the shower, and then he stumbled out onto that snowmobile that had been waiting outside and headed in the direction of his 2 daughters. What he seemed to have forgotten, or perhaps chose to ignore in his pursuit of his daughters was that it was minus 26 degrees outside. Any normal person would have struggled in that temperature, but Rolf was still wet from the shower and in thin, sort of nothingy clothes. He was not dressed for this weather, and if Randy hadn't found him when he did, he likely would have died from exposure within a couple of minutes. What doctors realised later was that those freezing cold temperatures had actually frozen the blood that was pouring from Rolf's head and face, and this quite possibly saved his life. Meanwhile, further down the road, the two perpetrators, and Lene and Trisha, had been driving for some time. And while she was on the snowmobile, Trisha was trying to come up with just some kind of escape plan, anything that she could think of. And she even thought about wrecking the snowmobile. She thought about throwing the man that she was with off and into a tree. But every plan that she came up with, she realised wouldn't work and eventually decided against because she knew that it would put her sister in danger. Now, eventually, they arrived at the family's town car, which could be unlocked with a code. And Vaughan ordered the girls to unlock the car, which they did. And then he made Trisha sit next to him in the front and made Lene sit next to Edward in the back. Vaughan had placed his gun in the boot or the trunk of the car when he arrived there, and when he sat down next to Trisha, he then pulled out a knife and told her not to worry and that he was as good with a knife as he was with a gun. However, the four of them did not make it far before the police vehicles that had been sent out to find them did manage to track them down. A high-speed chase ensued, and at one point, officers had actually shot at the town car, with one bullet piercing the vehicle just inches away from Lene's head. Now, I don't know what the reasoning was there. I don't know why they were potentially endangering the lives of these two hostages here. But either way, thankfully, they weren't hit. However, the high-speed chase ended about 40 miles southwest of the cabin, where the town car had sort of swerved in the chase. It swerved across lanes of traffic and then rolled backwards and over the edge of a hill. It did land at the bottom of that hill, but thankfully no one inside was hurt. Now, before the police were actually able to get down to the car, because of course it had gone down this hill, Vaughan pointed his gun at Edward. They had this agreement that if they were ever going to be caught, then one of them would shoot the other and then they would shoot themselves. But Edward did not like this plan when it was actually in action, and he saw this gun being pointed at him and just did not want to die in that moment. And so he actually jumped towards Vaughan and struggled with him and attempted to get that gun off of him. He did manage to get the gun, and then he turned to face one of the officers who was now at the car wreck. And he pointed that gun at one of the officers, but as soon as he did that, he saw that the officer already had his gun drawn, and so the two perpetrators dropped to the floor and they surrendered. Both men were charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted first-degree murder, and 2 counts of aggravated kidnapping. The charges would have been more, as they had actually planned to kill Sean as well, but as I mentioned earlier, Sean hadn't wanted to stay at the cabin. In fact, he'd said no to the invitation from his mum to stay that night. His reasoning was nothing to do with feeling uneasy. It was just because he didn't like how cold the cabin could get. And he knew that his mum would make him shovel snow on that long driveway from the road to the cabin in preparation for the big family party. He really wasn't there just out of a bit of luck of not wanting to shovel some snow. Claudia would later speak about how her mother's head was so damaged from the bullets that she actually had to have parts of her skull reconstructed with putty and then a wig put on her for the burial. When the officers arrived at the crime scene, one of them made his way towards the cabin door. He was about 10 feet away from the cabin door when he smelt something. It was burning, maybe of clothes or of hair, he thought. He then made his way into the cabin and saw an 18-inch puddle of blood, and it looked fresh. And as he made his way up the stairs, he could see a number of bullet holes strewn across the walls. And there was even a bloody smudge on one of the walls, and it looked like a handprint. And beyond that lay the bodies that they knew they would find, the bodies of Beth and Kay, mother and daughter, dead from gunshot wounds. Ultimately, Vaughan was convicted and sentenced to death, but in 2020, his conviction was overturned due to a federal court deeming he had ineffective counsel all those years ago. In 2021, however, a 3-judge panel reinstated his death penalty conviction. Edward was convicted and sentenced to life in prison and eligible for parole by the time he's 85. Interestingly, Lene received a letter from Edward in 2001. She didn't know what she wanted to do, and she sat with that letter for over 9 years before she decided she did want to respond. Since then, the pair have been speaking, writing letters to each other often, with Lene practicing forgiveness and healing, saying that she felt an enormous sense of relief when she decided to forgive Edward, but she'd never forget. And she's firm in her belief that he belongs in prison and should remain there for the rest of his life. After the cabin had burned down, Lene, Trisha and Rolf went back and they rebuilt it. And they made it better than before. Rolf told his girls that lightning never strikes twice in the same location, and Lene found great peace in that. Trisha said that they were never going to let Edward and Vaughan take that away from them, take the things that they loved and enjoyed in their lives away from them. They took away their grandmother and mother, but that is where it ended. Hello. Sorry, I'm having technical issues, hence the outfit change, hence the time of day change. I don't know if you'll be able to tell that. I just wanted to quickly pop on here and say thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Red Rum. If you enjoyed the episodes, please do consider sharing with your family, your friends, anyone true crimey. Facebook groups really help. Reddit, Instagram, anything, social medias. It's all really helpful and I really appreciate it, and I see you and I hear you, and yeah, I'm just so thankful if you do it, if you plan to do it in the future, or even if you just leave a nice comment or just a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for your case suggestions too. Other than that, I'll see you next week for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.